Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center. My name is Matthew Jordan, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center here at Cuyahoga Community College. And I'd like to begin our evening by telling you a little bit about the center, our programs, and the motivation for tonight's event. The Mandel Humanities Center was created in 2015 through the generous support of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation, which gave Tri-C the largest gift in the college's history, $10 million to fund a center for the study of the humanities and an academic program, the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Scholars Academy. And this is where I realized I didn't grab the little clicker for the PowerPoint slide. Aha, thank you. It would have been so elegant if I'd done this. Pretend the last 30 seconds didn't happen. A center for the study of the humanities and an academic program, the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Scholars Academy. Thank you, thank you. That would thank you. That would combine humanistic inquiry with leadership development and civic engagement. 85% of Tri-C graduates remain in Northeast Ohio after completing their degrees, and the vision for this center is that we will have a meaningful impact on engaging and training a new generation of Cleveland area leaders. Students who graduate from the Mandel Scholars Academy go on to earn their bachelor's degrees at four-year universities and return home to Cleveland to build their careers and serve in leadership roles throughout the region and across all sectors of the economy. Every student in the Mandel Scholars Academy receives the most generous scholarship offered by the college, up to $2,580 per semester, designed to cover the cost of full-time tuition, fees, and books for Cuyahoga County residents. They take a series of courses connected to the mission of the Mandel Center: the individual in society, history of Cleveland, and community engagement, a unique course in which Mandel scholars work with community partners such as the YWCA, Idea Stream, or the Cleveland Botanical Garden to solve problems and answer questions facing our community. They interact with local and national leaders, meeting in small groups with people like Starbucks CEO Emeritus Howard Schultz, former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, Stephanie Sheldon, the founder of the Cleveland Flea, and Jim Tressel, the president of Youngstown State University and former football coach at the Ohio State University. Our students also have opportunities to travel, with over 40% participating in trips to academic conferences or educational destinations, including, this year, New York City, Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, Alabama, and in partnership with Hiram College, Dublin, and Belfast in Ireland. In short, we have a lot going on. If you are considering pursuing a college degree, or if you know someone who is, we hope that you and they will consider applying for the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Scholars Academy here at Cuyahoga Community College. Of course, here at Tri-C, we pride ourselves on being not merely a community college, but on being the community's college. And that's where tonight's event fits in. We hope that the Mandel Center may serve as a home for thoughtful and high-quality discussion of topics in the humanities and social sciences, providing opportunities for members of the public to hear from leading scholars about topics across a wide range of disciplines. Before I introduce the scholars from whom we'll hear this evening, however, let me address one business matter and tell you a little bit about the context from which tonight's conversation emerges. First, business. If you are registered to vote in Cuyahoga County, please be aware that Issue 3 on the November 5th ballot is a renewal of Tri-C's operating levy. This levy appears on the ballot every 5 years, and Cuyahoga County voters have a long history of supporting it. We're very thankful for that, as without voter support, the college would have to make significant cuts across the board, dramatically and adversely impacting our technical programs, workforce development, and four-year transfer programs alike. Passing Issue 3 is necessary in order for Cuyahoga Community College to continue to provide high-quality, affordable education for residents of Northeast Ohio. Fact sheets are available on many of your seats. There's also some extras down in the front row if you're curious for more information. Please be sure to pick one up on your way out if you've not done so already. And please don't forget to vote on November 5th. With that said, let's shift gears and talk about the authors we've gathered to discuss this evening and our plans for tonight. Like many people, I first encountered C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien through their fantasy writings. I read and loved the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid, and while I was in college, studying philosophy at Ohio University, I discovered that Lewis had written quite a lot about philosophical topics. I found his writings quite helpful as I was struggling and wrestling in very personal ways with issues in the philosophy of religion, and Lewis's intellectual impact on me was and remains significant. Also, while I was in college, I read, or rather devoured, The Lord of the Rings for the first time. I have vivid memories of sitting in a bedroom in France while spending a semester abroad, knowing that I should be immersing myself in the French language, but unable to put down my tattered copy of The Return of the King until I'd learned for certain what happened to Frodo and Sam and the rest of them, and possibly shedding a tear or two at those catastrophic moments when it seems suddenly that everything sad will come untrue, if I may be so bold as to steal some of Tolkien's own language. It was also while I was in France that I learned, serendipitously, that Lewis and Tolkien were contemporaries. And not just contemporaries, but colleagues. And not just colleagues, but friends. Friends who met regularly at an Oxford pub called the Eagle and Child to drink beer and smoke pipes and talk. I had to make a pilgrimage. I traveled to Oxford, fell in love with the city, and decided that if I ever succeeded in my goal of becoming a philosophy professor, I would look for opportunities to teach courses on Lewis and Tolkien and hopefully bring students to England to spend a week or so in the city where they spent their adult lives. Now, let me pause to say that I'm keenly aware that no one is here tonight to hear my autobiography. So let it suffice to say that 15 years after that pilgrimage, I found myself in the airport in Montgomery, Alabama, preparing to embark on the first of 4 Lewis and Tolkien-themed study abroad trips I would lead as a member of the philosophy faculty at Auburn University at Montgomery. The courses I taught afforded me the luxury of reading and discussing a wide range of Lewis's and Tolkien's works, and the opportunity to become acquainted with the extraordinary breadth and depth of their minds. The study abroad trips brought an additional benefit. In seeking opportunities for my students to learn more about Lewis and Tolkien, I reached out to leading scholars, experts who might be available to serve as guest lecturers during our trips to Oxford. I was pleased to discover that several of the brightest lights in this region of the scholarly sky were not merely available, but willing. And what's more, it turned out they were tremendously engaging speakers and genuinely delightful human beings to boot. When I had the opportunity to return home to Cleveland just over a year ago and started to think about what sorts of public programming we might be able to offer at the Mandel Center, the idea of bringing 2 of those scholars here for a Lewis versus Tolkien event, a lighthearted but substantive and scholarly academic debate, seemed too good not to pursue. And now, here we are, ready for a battle of the literary masters. Defending the assertion that John Ronald Reuel Tolkien is a greater author than Clive Staples Lewis is Dr. Holly Ordway. Dr. Ordway holds a master's degree in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola University, and a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She taught for 7 years at Miracosta College in Oceanside, California, and left her position as a tenured professor there to join the faculty at Houston Baptist University, where she teaches in the online Master of Arts in Apologetics program. In addition to several dozen essays, articles, and book chapters, she has published 2 books of her own and is working on a 3rd, Tolkien's Modern Reading, due to be published by Kent State University Press in 2020. She is also a published poet, an accomplished fencer, and a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute. Please welcome Dr. Holly Ordway. Dr. Ordway's adversary in this debate, Dr. Michael Ward, will argue that Lewis is a greater author than Tolkien. Dr. Ward holds degrees in English, theology, and divinity from the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, and the University of St. Andrews, respectively. Described by the Times Literary Supplement as the foremost living Lewis scholar, he too has authored or edited several books, including the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner, and the award-winning Planet Narnia, The 7 Heavens and the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. Dr. Ward is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford University, and like Dr. Ordway, teaches in the online apologetics program at Houston Baptist University. Please welcome Dr. Michael Ward. Also with us on the stage are three Cleveland area actors who will be reading excerpts from the writings of Lewis and Tolkien: Matthew Harris, Jackie Lowy, and Mark Moritz. Mr. Harris is a native of Orange, Ohio, graduating from Orange High School in 2014, and from the musical theater program at Baldwin Wallace University in 2018. His regional credits include the part of Michael in Tick, Tick, Boom at Playhouse Square, and he will appear on Broadway this winter when Girl from the North Country opens at the Belasco Theater in New York City. Ms. Lowy is a native New Yorker who spent 3 years on Broadway before relocating to Cleveland to join the cast of Sheer Madness. In addition to appearances on stage at the Hannah Theater, Dobama, the Cleveland Playhouse, and Interplay Jewish Theater, she is a recently retired professor of English, Theater, and Communication at Notre Dame College in South Euclid. And Mr. Moritz originated the role of talk show host in the Broadway production of the Stephen Sondheim Hal Prince musical, Merrily We Roll Along. Mark has an MFA in theater from Kent State University and has worked extensively in regional theater as well as in film, television, and commercials. Please give them a round of applause. The format of tonight's debate will be as follows. Dr. Ward will speak first, followed by Dr. Ordway. Each speaker will have 45 minutes to make his or her case. We will then have roughly 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience, and we will conclude by determining a winner of the debate and raffling off a pair of fabulous prizes. Now, let me ask you to make sure that all cell phones are in silent mode, to avoid any unnecessary noise, and that includes leaning over to the person next to you and whispering about what a wonderful event this is. And should you need to leave this evening's event early, please do so as discreetly as possible. Dr. Ward, the podium is yours.
Lewis versus Tolkien. Am I illuminated? Amplified? Yes. Lewis versus Tolkien. Who is better? Lewis, obviously. And I'm sure you will agree with me. You look like an intelligent and perceptive audience. And so I'm sure you'll recognize the truth of the matter, that C.S. Lewis is much, much better than J.R.R. Tolkien. John Ronald Rural Tolkien, or is it Tolkien? And is it I-E-N at the end of his name, or E-I-N? Many people get confused. So at the very least, I think you'll have to agree right from the outset that Lewis's name is easier to pronounce and easier to spell. So that's one major point in his favor. Another point in Lewis's favor is simply this. He was better looking. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be really, really ridiculously good looking? Well, don't ask Tolkien. Thin-shouldered, pallid, tense, a greasy parting in the center of his hair. You know, I'm just saying. As for their most important and famous works, the Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings, did you know that Tolkien himself admitted that he would never have finished writing The Lord of the Rings if it hadn't been for Lewis's encouragement? If Lewis hadn't constantly badgered Tolkien to complete The Lord of the Rings, he would never have produced his master work. Or, if he had finished it, he wouldn't have offered it for publication, because it was only Lewis who ever convinced Tolkien that there would be an audience for the kind of thing he was writing. So in fact, ladies and gentlemen, we owe The Lord of the Rings to C.S. Lewis. He's the author, effectively, of both these works. I don't think that's overstated. However, if you insist on attributing The Lord of the Rings to Tolkien, how interesting that it is less popular than the Narnia books. In a survey of British readers published in the UK National Press just 2 months ago, August 2019, the most popular work of fiction listed was Lewis's classic The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Yes, Narnia came in at number 1. There were no Tolkien titles anywhere in the top 10. What a loser. It took Tolkien decades to write The Lord of the Rings, even with the encouragement of C.S. Lewis. Tolkien had the gestational rapidity of an elephant. He was a constipated writer. Lewis himself said that Tolkien had the work rate of a coral insect. Lewis, on the other hand, was amazingly productive, bringing out almost a book a year from his adulthood onwards, and in so many different genres. And not just the number, it's the variety of works that testify to Lewis's superior genius. Poetry, sci-fi, philosophy, apologetics, moral satire, journalism, children's literature, mythic novels, literary criticism, literary history, philology, autobiography. I could go on. What quantity, what quality. And one of their mutual friends, George Sayer, even remarked that Tolkien was a little bit envious of Lewis's fluency. Yes, that's why your tickets for Tolkien are green. Green for envy. Whereas your tickets for Lewis are red with jovial merriment and enthusiasm. Tolkien was a man of narrow tastes. As his official biographer said, Tolkien read little modern fiction and took no notice of it. He thought English literature ended with Chaucer, and even Shakespeare was too modern for Tolkien. In short, Tolkien was stuck in the past, a backward-looking, fuddy-duddy curmudgeon. Lewis, by contrast, was expansive, inclusive, generous, magnanimous. Lewis read everything and remembered everything, as one of his friends remarked, and he was also much wittier, much funnier. When he was about 9 years old, he came downstairs, sat in an armchair, pressed the tips of his fingers together, and announced to the world at large, "I have a prejudice against the French." His father, interrupted in the process of a long division sum, spun round, snorted, and said, "Why on earth do you have a prejudice against the French?" "If I knew that, it would not be a prejudice," said the 9-year-old Lewis. When he was an adult, Lewis's holiday of choice was always a walking tour with friends. At the end of one such tour, unshaven, muddy, smelly, and looking not unlike a tramp, he boarded a train for his journey back home to Oxford. A prim-looking, well-dressed lady opposite him in the carriage leant forward and said, "Excuse me, do you have a first-class ticket?" "Yes, thank you," said Lewis, "but I need it for myself." On one occasion, Lewis and 4 friends were planning to go to an opera in Covent Garden in London, and the responsibility for buying the tickets was placed on the shoulders of Lewis's friend Cecil Harwood. Lewis made it clear in a letter to Harwood how very important it was that he should get the tickets well ahead of time. In mock 18th century English, Lewis wrote to Harwood as follows.
"Dear Harwood, it is vain to conceal from you the solicitude we feel for our seats at Covent Garden. Pray, sir, exert yourself. Reflect that no small part of the satisfaction of 5 persons depends upon your conduct, that the object of their desires is rational and innocent, and that their desires are fervent and of long standing. Omit no manly degree of importunity that may achieve our object, and thus, my dear sir, give me one more reason to subscribe myself your most obliged, most obedient servant,
But guess
C.S.
what?
Lewis."
Harwood somehow, despite this helpful encouragement, managed to forget to book the tickets. and the whole trip to London had to be cancelled. Lewis was not amused by the letter in which Harwood confessed his failure. Lewis wrote back to Harwood in the following manner.
Sir, I have read your pathetical letter with such sentiments as it naturally suggests, and write to assure you that you need to expect from me no ungenerous reproach. It would be cruel if it were possible, and impossible if it were attempted, to add to the mortification which you must now be supposed to suffer. Where I cannot console, it is far from my purpose to aggravate, for it is part of the complicated misery of your state that while I pity your sufferings, I cannot innocently wish them lighter. He would be no friend to your reason or your virtue who would wish you to pass over so great a miscarriage in heartless frivolity or brutal insensibility. As the loss is irretrievable, so your remorse will be lasting. As those whom you have betrayed are your friends, so your conduct admits of no exculpation. As you were once virtuous, so now you must be forever miserable. I will not paint to you the consequences of your conduct, which are doubtless daily and nightly before your eyes. Believe, my dear sir, that I forgive you. As soon as you can, pray let me know through some respectable acquaintance what plans you have formed for the future. In what quarter of the globe do you intend to sustain that irrevocable exile, hopeless penury, and perpetual disgrace to which you have condemned yourself? Do not give in to the sin of despair. Learn from this example the fatal consequences of error and hope. In some humbler station and some distant land, that you may yet become useful to your species. Yours, etc., C.S. Lewis.
It's not over yet. Harwood, surprisingly, did not go into exile. Not only did he decide brazenly to stay in England, he even requested the opportunity of visiting Lewis at his house in Oxford. Lewis said that he might visit in the company of their mutual friend Owen Barfield, and wrote to Harwood in the following magnanimous fashion.
Sir, your resolution of seeing me and receiving my forgiveness face to face before you forever quit these shores does not displease me. As you have rightly judged, to admit you to my house would now be an offense, but you will be welcome to the grounds. You will please to observe the strictest propriety of behavior while you remain there, and to be guided in everything by the directions of Mr. Barfield. Under his protection, I doubt not that you will be able to achieve the journey without any great disaster or indecency. Do not hold any communication with your fellow travelers in the steam train without his approval. You had best abstain from all use of fermented liquors. Many things lawful in themselves are to be denied to one who dare not risk a further miscarriage. Above all, do not attempt to shorten your journey by any approaches to familiarity with your fellow female passengers. Do not bring with you any musical instrument. Your obedient servant, C.S. Lewis.
Well, enough about Lewis's wit, but I don't think that you will find any comparable example of witticism and humor and friendly baiting in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. After Lewis's wit, let us turn to his work as an apologist, that is to say, a public defender of the Christian faith. Lewis is well known for works like Mere Christianity, Miracles, the Screwtape Letters, the Four Loves, the Problem of Pain. He became a Christian in his early 30s and devoted a good deal of his output as a writer and indeed as a speaker and broadcaster. He broadcast over the BBC radio waves during the Second World War to explaining the Christian faith to his fellow citizens. He wrote an autobiography explaining his spiritual path called Surprised by Joy, in which he talks about how from an early age he was haunted by fugitive, powerful sensations of longing, joy as he calls them, what the German romantics would call a Sehnsucht, these inconsolable stabs of longing, these passionate yearnings for union with the good, the true, and the beautiful. And those passionate transitory moments accompanied him throughout his life, and he was continually wondering where they came from, what they told him about the nature of the universe. Eventually, to cut a very long story short, he locates those feelings in God, in the transcendent, in that which cannot be fully experienced and enjoyed in this life. That's his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. He distilled it, in a sense, in a sermon that he preached in the University Church at Oxford in the early 1940s, a sermon called The Weight of Glory, which is one of his finest pieces of English prose. And we're now going to hear an excerpt from it.
When I attempted a few minutes ago to describe our spiritual longings, I was omitting one of their most curious characteristics. We usually notice it just as the moment of vision dies away, as the music ends, or as the landscape loses the celestial light. What we feel then has been well described by Keats as the journey homeward to habitual self. You know what I mean. For a few minutes, we have had the illusion of belonging to that world. Now we wake to find that it is no such thing. We have been mere spectators. Beauty has smiled, but not to welcome us. Her face was turned in our direction, but not to see us. We have not been accepted, welcomed, or taken into the dance. We may go when we please. We may stay if we can. Nobody marks us. A scientist may reply that since most of the things we call beautiful are inanimate, it is not very surprising that they take no notice of us. This, of course, is true. It is not the physical objects that I am speaking of, but that indescribable something of which they become, for a moment, the messengers. And part of the bitterness which mixes with the sweetness of that message is due to the fact that it so seldom seems to be a message intended for us, but rather something we have overheard. By bitterness, I mean pain, not resentment. We should hardly dare to ask that any notice be taken of ourselves, but we pine. The sense that in this universe we are treated as strangers, the longing to be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality, is part of our inconsolable secret. And surely, from this point of view, the promise of glory, in the sense described, becomes highly relevant to our deep desire. For glory means good report with God, acceptance by God, response, acknowledgement, and welcome into the heart of things. The door on which we have been knocking all our lives will be opened at last. And this brings me to the other sense of glory. Glory as brightness, splendor, luminosity. We are to shine as the sun. We are to be given the morning star. I think I begin to see what it means. In one way, of course, God has given us the morning star already. You can go and enjoy the gift on many fine mornings if you get up early enough. What more, you may ask, do we want? But we want so much more. Something the books on aesthetics take little notice of, but the poets and the mythologies know all about it. We do not merely want to see beauty, though God knows even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words. To be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. That is why we have peopled air and earth and water with gods and goddesses and nymphs and elves. That, though we cannot, yet these projections can, enjoy in themselves that beauty, grace, and power of which nature is the image. That is why the poets tell us such lovely falsehoods. They talk as if the west wind could really sweep into a human soul, but it can't. They tell us that beauty born of murmuring sound will pass into a human face, but it won't, or not yet. For if we take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star and cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, then we may surmise that both the ancient myths and the modern poetry, so false as history, may be very near the truth as prophecy. At present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. When human souls have become as perfect in voluntary obedience as the inanimate creation is in its lifeless obedience, then they will put on its glory, or rather that greater glory of which nature is only the first sketch. For you must not think that I am putting forward any heathen fancy of being absorbed into nature. Nature is mortal. We shall outlive her. When all the suns and nebulae have passed away, each one of you will still be alive. Nature is only the image, the symbol, but it is the symbol Scripture invites me to use. We are summoned to pass in through nature, beyond her, into that splendor which she fitfully reflects. And in there, in beyond nature, we shall eat of the tree of life.
A powerful passage. A powerful passage, I think you will agree. One of the best things I think Lewis wrote as an apologist. I think he could be described in a way as the apologist of hope. He was always looking heavenwards, looking for the fulfillment of that longing, looking for the achievement, the consummation of glory. And that was not just an idle hope born of some romantic wish fulfillment. It came out of the struggle with a good deal of suffering that he experienced in the course of his life. His mother died when he was only 9 years old. Lewis was then sent abroad from Northern Ireland. He was raised in Belfast. He was sent overseas to England, where he was schooled in perhaps the worst school in England. I don't exaggerate. The headmaster of that school was later certified insane and died in a lunatic asylum. Lewis then had some more successful educational experiences before going off to war. He fought in the French trenches during the First World War. He was a second lieutenant in the British Army and was very nearly killed in the spring of 1918 when a shell fell in his trench, obliterating the man next to him, spattering him, Lewis, full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life. He knew all about suffering firsthand, and not just in his own individual life too, but across his whole generation. 750,000 British servicemen were killed in the Great War. Lewis himself was so nearly one of them. He had an out-of-body experience. He looked down on himself from a great height, and the thought occurred to him, here is a picture of a man dying. But of course he didn't die. He survived, and he was invalided back to England, where he spent 6 months recovering from his war wounds. So Lewis's early life was in many ways very dark, full of difficulty, full of death and disaster. And his eventual turn to faith in his early 30s was hard won. He really looked down the barrel of the gun, of the bleakness and darkness of life, and as it were, came out the other side. So many of his books end with depictions of heaven. His apologetic works, such as The Problem of Pain, ends with a marvelous depiction of heaven. Likewise, his book on prayer, to a certain extent, even his book on love and his book on the Psalms. His suffering hadn't finished with the end of the First World War. He later lost his wife. He married late in his 50s. You may have seen the film Shadowlands, which details this remarkable episode in Lewis's life. A much better film, by the way, than the Tolkien biopic. It's a beautiful, poignant, and moving episode in his life, this late love, and all the more poignant because Joy, his wife, died very young, at the age of 45, after only 3 years' marriage to Lewis. And Lewis wrote an account of his bereavement entitled A Grief Observed, which again wrestles very honestly, very frankly, with the difficulties of losing one you love, but nonetheless coming through to a note of hope at the end. So I think if you want to summarize Lewis as an apologist, I would describe him as the apologist of hope. Lewis was a wit. He was an apologist. Thirdly, he was a scholar, a brilliant, brilliant mind, one of the greatest intellects of his generation. He got a triple first from Oxford. That's just about the highest you can possibly even conceive, let alone achieve. He did a degree in classics first, and then in 1 year got a first-class degree in English, a degree that normally takes you 3 years. I read English at Oxford. It took me 3 years to get my degree, and I didn't get a first. Sometimes I hate C.S. Lewis. Soon after he graduated, he began his academic career teaching at Oxford. He began in philosophy, but was soon elected to a fellowship in English at the most beautiful college in Oxford, and therefore the most beautiful college in England, and therefore the most beautiful college, only this one accepted, of course, in the world. Magdalen College, if you haven't been there, it really is just stunningly beautiful. And he taught there for 30 years. Became a very popular lecturer in the wider university, but also a very effective tutor, one-to-one with his students in the college. He published a good deal as an academic. He made his name with a study of medieval allegorical love poetry, the Allegory of Love. He followed that up with numerous other volumes, just to mention 2 of them, a groundbreaking study of Milton and Paradise Lost, and his magnum opus, English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. 700 pages of hard-won scholarship and insight, but also communicated in the most readable fashion. Lewis was one of the great stylists of the 20th century. Much more readable, I must say. I'm not now joking. Much more readable as a scholarly writer than Tolkien. He was quite knotted and gnarled and sinuous. Lewis was always perfectly clear. He could not write an unreadable sentence if he had tried. Towards the end of his academic career, when Lewis had moved to Cambridge, a position, by the way, which, it must be said, Tolkien helped him get. So there are some good things about Tolkien. When he was at Cambridge, he wrote a very ripe and reflective late work all about the reasons why we read books and what is it that makes a book worth reading. This is a work called An Experiment in Criticism, where Lewis gives a very generous account of what it is that we seek in books. We don't always seek to be pampered. We don't always seek agreement. What we long for is to get out of our own perspective and share the perspective of another person, maybe even an animal, whatever the author has imagined for us. We put on a different pair of spectacles and we see the world in a new light. That's one of the great things about reading, imaginative reading in particular. So let us now have a few paragraphs from the end of that book, An Experiment in Criticism. I hand over to Mark.
We seek an enlargement of our being. We want to be more than ourselves. We want to see with other eyes, to imagine with another imaginations, to feel with other hearts as well as with our own. We are not content to be Leibnizian monads. We demand windows. Literature is a series of windows, even of doors. One of the things we feel after reading a great work is, I have got out. Or from another point of view, I have got in. Pierced the shell of some other monad and discovered what it is like inside. Good reading, therefore, though it is not essentially an affectional or moral or intellectual activity, has something in common with all three. In love, we escape from ourself into one another. In the moral sphere, every act of justice or charity involves putting ourselves in the other person's place and thus transcending our own competitive particularity. In coming to understand anything, we are rejecting the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. The primary impulse of each is to maintain and aggrandize himself. The secondary impulse is to go out of the self, to correct its provincialism and heal its loneliness. In love, in virtue, in the pursuit of knowledge, and in the reception of the arts, we are doing this. Obviously, this process can be described either as an enlargement or as a temporary annihilation of the self. But that is an old paradox. He that loseth his self shall, he that loseth his life shall save it. We therefore delight to enter into other men's beliefs, those say of Lucretius or D.H. Lawrence, even though we think them untrue, and into their passions, though we think them depraved, like those sometimes of Marlowe or Carlyle, and also into their imaginations, though they lack all realism of content. This must not be understood as if I were making this kind of literature into a department within the literature of knowledge, a department which existed to gratify our rational curiosity about other people's psychology. It is not a question of knowing in that sense at all. It is a connaître, not a savoir. We become these other selves, not only nor chiefly in order to see what they are like, but in order to see what they see, to occupy for a while their seat in the great theater, to use their spectacles and be made free of whatever insights, joys, terrors, wonders, or merriment those spectacles reveal. Hence, it is irrelevant whether the mood expressed in a poem was truly and historically the poet's own, or one that he had also imagined. What matters is his power to make us live it. This, so far as I can see, is the specific value or good of literature considered as logos. It admits us to experiences other than our own. They are not any more than our personal experiences, all equally worth having. Some, as we say, interest us more than others. The cause of this interest are naturally extremely various and differ from one man to another. It may be the typical, and we say, how true, or the abnormal, and we say, how strange. It may be the beautiful, the terrible, the awe-inspiring, the exhilarating, the pathetic, the comic, or the merely piquant. Literature gives the entree to them all. Those of us who have been true readers all our life seldom fully realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors. We realize it best when we talk with a literary friend. He may be full of goodness and good sense, but he inhabits a tiny world. In it, we should be suffocated. The man who is contented to be only himself, and therefore less as self, is in prison. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through those of others. Reality, even seen through the eyes of many, is not enough. I will see what others have invented. Even the eyes of all humanity are not enough. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. Very gladly would I learn what face things present to a mouse or a bee. More gladly still would I perceive the olfactory world charged with all the information and emotion it carries for a dog. Literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. There are mass emotions which heal the wound, but they destroy the privilege. In them, our separate selves are pooled and we sink back into sub-individuality. But in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad of eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do.
Thank you, Mark. Another powerful passage, and another useful summary of one department of Lewis's output as a writer and thinker. That focus upon connaître, not savoir, that is to say, knowledge by acquaintance, not merely knowledge about, not just factual knowledge, not just dashboard knowledge. Think of connaître and saber in Spanish if you don't know French. That's what Lewis is talking about. Trying to get in, trying to look along the beam of a perspective. It's a very inclusive and large-hearted approach to reading, which I think Lewis also exemplified in his personal relations. He was very content to dialogue with people with whom he profoundly disagreed about some of the deepest things, and yet he always maintained courtesy and politeness. He was firm in his own convictions, but not so rigid that he couldn't listen to others. And this is one of the reasons why he's so great a literary critic, because he can get into so many different worldviews, into so many different perspectives. And if you want to get into his scholarship, I would recommend that the book you turn to is not one of those that I've so far mentioned, but a collection called Selected Literary Essays, which has treatments of Jane Austen, for instance, and John Bunyan, and four-letter words, and a great variety of topics, all of them treated with his characteristic lucidity and generosity. So Lewis was a wit. He was the apologist of hope. He was a great scholar. Fourthly and finally, he was a poet. And by poet, I mean a maker, a literary maker, an imaginer. He made literary artifacts. He knew how to handle language, how to put words together. Sometimes it was in verse. In fact, the first 2 volumes that he ever published were books of poetry. But he never achieved a great reputation as a versifier, as a poet in the traditional sense. But his poetic gifts, his ability to understand symbols and metaphors, that gift was put to great effect in his fiction. He's best known, of course, for the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. These books came out 1 per year from 1950 to 1956, and they're still selling incredibly well. 3 or 4 million copies annually worldwide, I understand, and they've been made recently into, or at least the first 3 books have been made into feature films. The first book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, is probably easily Lewis's best known work. If you stopped anyone in the street and put a microphone in front of their mouth and said, C.S. Lewis, almost certainly, I think, if they knew anything by him, it would be The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Though even on that count, sometimes people can get confused. I lived for 3 years in C.S. Lewis's house in Oxford, the Kilns, as a kind of resident warden and curator. I had the great privilege of sleeping in Lewis's old bedroom and studying in his study. And 3 times while I was living in that house, journalists rang up. They were writing articles about C.S. Lewis. And one of them, when I answered the phone, said, "Hello, is that Mr. Lewis?" By that stage, he'd been dead for about 40 years. And the other journalist who rang up said, "Hello, I'm writing an article about C.S. Lewis and his great classic work of children's fiction, Alice in Wonderland." So people can get confused even on this count. But The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is a truly classic work of children's fiction. Lewis said that he felt that he had to write this work or burst. He was big with it. Sometimes he used the imagery of pregnancy when he was carrying around with him a great idea that just had to be put down on paper. And The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe seems to have, as it were, fallen into his lap ready-made, a gift from the gods. It's got a perfect lightness and economy and balance, a truly classic work. The subsequent 6 volumes are very good too, though perhaps not classic in that sense. My favourite actually is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but a close contender is The Horse and His Boy, the 5th book, which is one of the least well-known actually, but it contains one of the greatest passages, in my view, that Lewis ever wrote in his fiction. It's a passage where the hero of the story, a young boy, a young apparently orphaned boy, Shasta, who has been raised by a cruel stepfather, has managed to get himself lost in the mountains. And as he wanders through this mountain pass, hardly knowing where he's going, he begins to sense that he's not alone.
Being very tired and having nothing inside him, Shasta felt so sorry for himself that the tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all of this was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone or somebody was walking beside him. It was pitch dark, and he could see nothing. And the thing or person was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was the breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature, and he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had really no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard long ago that these were giants in the northern countries. He bit his lip in terror. But now that he really had something to cry about, he stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope he had only imagined it. But just as he was becoming quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be his imagination. Anyway, he had felt the hot breath of that sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything on a breakaway and a wild gallop. So he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no longer.
Who are you?
He said, scarcely above a whisper.
One who has waited long for you to speak,
Said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep.
Are you a giant?
Asked Shasta.
You might call me a giant,
Said the large voice.
but I am not like the creatures you call giants.
I can't see you at all.
Said Shasta after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come into his head, he said almost in a scream,
You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please, please do go away. What harm have I ever done you? Oh, I am the unluckiest person in the whole world.
Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face.
There,
It said.
that is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows.
Shasta was a little reassured by the breath, So he told how he had never known his real father or mother and had been brought up sternly by the fishermen. And then he told the story of his escape and how they were chased by lions and forced to swim for their lives, and of all their dangers in Tashbaan, and about his night among the tombs and how the beasts howled at him out of the desert. And he told about the heat and thirst of their desert journey, and how they were almost at their goal when another lion chased them and wounded Aravis, and also how long it was since he had had anything to eat.
I do not call you unfortunate,
Said the large voice.
Don't you think it was bad luck to meet so many lions?
Said Shasta.
There was only one lion.
Said the voice.
What on earth do you mean? I've just told you there were at least 2 the first night, and
There was only one, but he was swift of foot.
how do you know?
I was the lion.
And as Shasta gaped with open mouth and said nothing, the voice continued.
I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you could reach King Loon in time. And I was the lion you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to a shore where a man sat, wakeful at night, to receive you.
Then it was you who wounded Aravis?
It was I.
But what for?
Child,
Said the voice.
I am telling you your story, not hers. I tell no one any story but his own.
Who are you?
Asked Shasta.
Myself.
Said the voice, very deep and low so that the earth shook. And again,
Myself.
loud and clear and gay. And then the third time,
Myself.
whispered so softly you could hardly hear it. And yet it seemed to come from all round you as if the leaves rustled with it. Shasta was no longer afraid that the voice belonged to something that would eat him, nor that it was the voice of a ghost, but a new and different sort of trembling came over him. Yet he felt glad, too. The mist was turning from black to gray and from gray to white. This must have begun to happen some time ago. But while he had been talking to the thing, he had not been noticing anything else. Now, the whiteness around him became a shining whiteness. His eyes began to blink. Somewhere ahead, he could hear birds singing. He knew the night was over at last. He could see the mane and ears and head of his horse quite easily now. A golden light fell on them from the left, and he thought it was the sun. He turned and saw, pacing beside him, taller than the horse, a lion. The horse did not seem to be afraid of it, or else could not see it. It was from the lion that the light came. No one ever saw anything more terrible or beautiful. Luckily, Shasta had lived all his life too far south in Kellerman to have heard the tales that were whispered in Tashbaan about a dreadful Narnian demon that appeared in the form of a lion. And of course, he knew none of the true stories about Aslan, the great lion, the son of the emperor over the sea, the king above all high kings in Narnia. But after one glance at the lion's face, he slipped out of the saddle and fell at its feet. He couldn't say anything. But then he didn't want to say anything. And he knew he needn't say anything. The high king above all kings stooped towards him. Its mane and some strange and solemn perfume that hung about the mane was all round him. It touched its forehead with its tongue. It touched his forehead with its tongue. He lifted his face, and their eyes met. And then instantly the pale brightness of the mist and the fiery brightness of the lion rolled themselves together into a swirling glory and gathered themselves up and disappeared. He was alone with the horse on a grassy hillside under a blue sky. And there were birds singing.
Thank you very much. That's a great passage. One of the high points, I think, in the whole of Lewis's fictional output, and especially in the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis died relatively early, only the age of 64. He died on the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And on the 50th anniversary of his death, he was memorialized in Westminster Abbey in London. This memorial bears a line from one of his apologetic works. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that everything else is what I have tried to encapsulate for you tonight, because Lewis really did have an omnivorous appetite, not just in literature, but in faith, in hope, in charity. He's always been more popular in America than in Britain. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine as early as 1947. But that's just because you Americans are more discerning. A prophet is not without honor save in his own country. And I trust that American enthusiasm for Lewis will show itself again tonight, and there will be birds singing.
Holly, you can go straight up. I want to introduce you again. Thank you, Michael.
So, well, am I audible? Yes, very good, very good. So let me just get myself sorted here.
Don't get that
There.
one click there.
Yes, well, we've all heard enough about Lewis. Let us move on to greater things. So see, my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Michael Ward, would have us think that the CS of C.S. Lewis stands for certainly superior. But I can assure you, that's all just warm up for my side. J.R.R. Tolkien. We could say that the J.R.R.T. stands for just really, really terrific. Because after all, we shouldn't really, if we live in glass houses and we have names like Clive Staples, we really oughtn't to throw stones about names. And you all have your little tags of colored votes, and that green, far from being the green of envy, it's the green of life, of growth, of growing things, of creativity. Because Tolkien is the inventor of, for instance, Ents, the tree beard, and these other Ents, who, they're just marvelous inventions. And so we should think of that when we think of green. And we should think of red as C.S. Lewis becoming sort of red-faced with frustration as he is outpaced by his colleague. Because indeed, the very context of this debate puts Tolkien ahead. Because this isn't just a debate, it's a battle. It's the battle of the literary masters. And that sounds rather athletic, doesn't it? And C.S. Lewis was notoriously and self-admittedly bad at sports and games. He was clumsy. He was all thumbs. He never learned to drive a car because he just couldn't handle not crashing it. But Tolkien, on the other hand, was a rugby player as a teenager. He was so ferocious at rugby. He was tackling and throwing himself into these scrums, and this is all very ferocious. And then even when he became a don, an academic, he played tennis, he bicycled, even when he was teaching at Oxford. So already, I've only just started, and we can already see that Tolkien is more well-rounded, and not in the pudgy sense. Now, I will concede that if this were a race and not a battle, Lewis might pull ahead. Okay, sure, he could dash off a book a year. Okay, yeah. But does that really compare to the sheer persistence and patience and mind-boggling attention to detail that it took, for instance, for Tolkien to go back and revise whole chapters of The Lord of the Rings so that the phases of the moon matched up with where each of the characters were on the timeline. I mean, that's a genius level attention to detail. And compare that with C.S. Lewis and his slapdash approach to world building. I mean, come on. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you have, Narnia, this world, and all of a sudden we get Father Christmas. Father Christmas? I mean, among other things, shouldn't he be Father Aslan Mas? I'm just saying. So, really, I have to say that, the greatness of Lewis, okay, I will concede that he did nudge Tolkien into finishing his masterwork. But if you think about Lewis, and we recognize his greatness, and I'm willing to concede his greatness. He was a great man. But Tolkien was the greater man showing him the way. Now, for instance, consider Lewis as a Christian apologist. If it hadn't been for Tolkien, Lewis might never have become a Christian at all. When Lewis came to Oxford, he was still an atheist. He later became a believer in God, but by the time he met Tolkien, he was not a Christian, and it was Tolkien who helped convince him that Christianity is true. So really, Tolkien can take credit for all of Lewis's apologetics books. And now consider Lewis's success as a fiction writer. Now, his first science fiction novel came about because of a wager with Tolkien. They were talking to each other, and they were agreeing that there just weren't enough examples of the kind of science fiction or the kind of stories that they enjoyed. So they thought, well, we should write some of them ourselves. And so they made this wager, and the idea was that Tolkien would write a time travel story and Lewis would write a space travel story. So Tolkien's story was what would become The Lost Road, which I admit he never actually finished. Okay. And then Lewis's book, which he finished, became Out of the Silent Planet. And Tolkien helped to get it published. Now, Lewis had written the book, and Lewis was still at this time relatively unknown. He'd written this very obscure book called Pilgrim's Regress, which nobody understood. Even Lewis had to rewrite, he had to annotate it himself to help people understand it. So Lewis wasn't exactly a hot property on the literary scene, but Tolkien had published this best-selling book called The Hobbit. And he wrote to his publisher and said, oh, well, my friend C.S. Lewis has written this really excellent book. Because Tolkien was a great man. He knew a good book when he saw one, and he recognized that in Lewis. And he said to his publisher, well, I think this is worth publishing. And it turns out, his publisher couldn't himself publish it, passed on to someone else, and voila, we had Out of the Silent Planet published. And so if it weren't for Tolkien, we wouldn't have Lewis's science fiction. And even consider Narnia. Consider Lewis's series of Narnia books. They're very great books, but who wrote The Hobbit beforehand? Who showed Lewis that an academic could really be a success as a writer of children's stories? Yeah. So, but enough of that. We get the picture. Tolkien was kind of showing Lewis this is how it's done. But my case for Tolkien as a literary master rests squarely upon his merits. And I want to show you all tonight that J.R.R. Tolkien is a far more well-rounded figure than you might have guessed. He is indeed a true literary master. So the first thing that I want to talk about is love. Now, you could say that C.S. Lewis wrote the book on love, or rather wrote a book called The Four Loves. Well, okay, in that book, Lewis goes into a detailed explanation of 4 different types of love: affection, friendship, romantic love, and divine love. It's all very convincing and very good, but what Lewis wrote about these, Tolkien lived. So he lived and really embodied all 4 of these loves by Lewis's count: affection and friendship, and to be sure, but also romantic love and divine love. So, for instance, we have Tolkien married to his first love, Edith, for 55 years, until her death. They raised 4 children together, and they were devoted grandparents and great-grandparents. And there's a great story of George Sayre once coming to visit Tolkien and finding him, the great man, the great literary man, on the carpet with his great-grandchildren playing trains, going toot toot, yes, I'm Thomas the Tank Engine. It's just delightful. So here we have a man who, he's a genius, and he's perfectly willing to be expressing his love for his great-grandchildren by playing trains with them. So we have this really refreshing image, I think, with Tolkien. I think so often we have this idea that great artists have to break the bonds of family life, that you somehow can't really be a great artist unless you're going off and abandoning your wife and children and living decadent lives and having lots of conflict and being addicted to things and all that excitement. And here we have Tolkien writing the greatest novel of the 20th century at night after the kids have gone to bed. Good for him, Talk about breaking the stereotype. Now, Lewis once called Tolkien the most married man I know. Lewis at this time was still a bachelor, and he was still a bachelor and wrote the 4 loves. Just saying. So Tolkien was definitely a very married man. So it's easy to see him in that picture with his married life and think, oh yeah, okay, how cute, easy, nice, settled, comfortable storybook existence. But it wasn't an easy start for Tolkien. Go back in time. Picture him, an orphan, living in rented lodgings with almost no money. In fact, as an orphan, his guardian, Father Francis Morgan of the Birmingham Oratory, was paying some of Tolkien's school fees out of his own pocket. So Tolkien's only chance at success in life was if he could get a scholarship to Oxford University. So studying for this scholarship was pretty much the most important thing he could be doing. And then he meets a young woman, a fellow orphan named Edith. And now we'll hear Tolkien recalling those early days in one of his letters.
I fell in love with Edith at the approximate age of 18, and it was in a sense very unfortunate, and in a way very bad for me. These things are absorbing and nervously exhausting. I was a clever boy in the throes of work for a very necessary Oxford scholarship. The combined tensions nearly produced a bad breakdown. I muffed my exams, and though I ought to have got a good scholarship, I only landed by the skin of my teeth an exhibition of 60 pounds at Exeter, just enough with a school-leaving scholarship of the same amount to come up with on, assisted by my dear old guardian. I was clever, but not industrious or single-minded. A large part of my failure was due simply to not working, at least not at classics. Not because I was in love, but because I was studying something else, Gothic and whatnot. However, trouble arose, and I had to choose between disobeying and grieving or deceiving a guardian who had been a father to me more than most real fathers, but without any obligation, and dropping the love affair until I was 21. I don't regret my decision. For nearly 3 years, I did not see or write to my lover. It was extremely hard, painful, and bitter, especially at the first. But I don't think anything else would have justified marriage on the basis of a boy's affair, and probably nothing else would have hardened the will enough to give such an affair, however genuine a case of true love, permanence. On the night of my 21st birthday, I wrote again to your mother, January 3rd, 1913. On January 8th, I went back to her and became engaged and informed an astonished family. I picked up my socks and did a spot of work, and then war broke out the next year while I still had a year to go at college. In those days, chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in, especially for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage. No degree, no money, fiancé. I endured the obloquy and, hence becoming outspoken from relatives, stayed up and produced a first in finals in 1915. Bolted into the Army, July 1915. I found the situation intolerable and married on March 22nd. 1916. May found me crossing the channel. I still have the verse I wrote on the occasion, for the carnage of the Somme.
So here we get a glimpse of Tolkien's early years. We have Tolkien showing the love of a son to his father in his obedience to Father Francis, who was effectively his foster father, by going through the test of waiting to get engaged to Edith. And we see the romantic love of an impetuous young man. And what he doesn't mention in his letter, but what actually happened, is that when he wrote to Edith after 3 years to say, Edith, I'm ready, let's get engaged, she said, well, I'm actually engaged to someone else. And he rushed down to see her and convinced her to marry him instead. Well done, J.R.R. And so he gets engaged to her, and he is steadfast in finishing his studies because that's the only way he's going to provide for his wife when they marry. And then he marries on the brink of the First World War, and so he's going off to war while the woman he loves is waiting for him at home, and the world is falling apart around him. And he comes through that, and he comes home to her, and out of that, they raise a family, and through the Second World War. So that picture of comfort and security is hard won. And we even see this making its way into his stories, where is as part of the Silmarillion tales that makes its way into the Lord of the Rings, the story of Beren and Luthien. Beren, the mortal man who dares to love the elf maid Luthien. They go through great darkness and trouble together, and Luthien rescues him. So talk about a strong female character. And we have this story, and for Tolkien, this had a great autobiographical resonance because he identified himself with Beren and Edith with Luthien. He said, she was my Luthien and knew that she was. And it is these names that are on their joint gravestone in Wolvercross Cemetery in Oxford. So what an epic love story. So we have here that romantic love. But romantic love, as central as it was to Tolkien's life, was not the center of his life. What was the most important to Tolkien himself and the basis and source of all his other loves was a real awareness of divine love, the love of God, lived out in the Catholic Church, and especially for Tolkien, in the encounter with Jesus himself in the Blessed Sacraments. And here we have a picture of St. Gregory and Augustine Church, where Tolkien himself worshipped. And I have actually sat in that very pew where Tolkien would attend Mass. So this is a really a greatest importance for Tolkien, and he writes about it in one of his letters.
In the last resort, faith is an act of will, inspired by love. The temptation to unbelief, which really means rejection of our Lord and his claims, is always there within us. Part of us longs to find an excuse for it outside us. If Christ is a fraud and the gospel's fraudulent, then of course the spectacle exhibited by the church, in the sense of clergy, in history and today is simply evidence of a gigantic fraud. If not, however, then this spectacle is, alas, only what was to be expected. It began before the first Easter, and it does not affect faith at all, except that we may and should be deeply grieved. But we should grieve on our Lord's behalf and for him. It takes a fantastic will to unbelief to suppose that Jesus never really happened, and more to suppose that he did not say the things recorded of him. We must therefore either believe in him and in what he said and take the consequences, or reject him and take the consequences. For me, that church of which the Pope is the acknowledged head on earth has as chief claim that it is the one that has and still does ever defended the Blessed Sacrament and given it most honor, and put it, as Christ plainly intended, in the prime place. I witnessed, half comprehending, the heroic sufferings and early death in extreme poverty of my mother, who brought me into the church, and received the astonishing charity of Francis Morgan. But I fell in love with the Blessed Sacrament from the beginning, and by the mercy of God, never have fallen out again.
So we can see Tolkien's faith, like his love, was very realistic, grounded in understanding of suffering and doubt, but yet striving for that truth and recognizing that when he found it, when he found the real thing, he would cling to it, hold on to it with both hands. And that expression of divine love was really at the heart of who he was and everything that he did, everything that he wrote. And this takes us to Tolkien the apologist. And as I said before, we would owe a great deal to Tolkien just for that conversation he had with Lewis that night on Addison's Walk on the grounds of Magdalen College, because by helping Lewis to become a Christian, he helped set all of Lewis's future work in sharing the faith and defending the faith into play. Now, Tolkien himself had fairly firm views about people sticking to their specialty. So he wasn't really particularly thrilled about Lewis's broadcast talks that later became Mere Christianity. And he really wasn't all that thrilled about Lewis's books of popular apologetics. But that was just because he thought that literary critics really ought to stick to doing literary criticism, and they should leave theology to the theologians and preaching to the pastors. So Tolkien, sticking to his own sort of sense of what was fitting, never wrote any books of Christian apologetics. But what he did was more subtle, more sophisticated, we might say. So to borrow Tolkien's own metaphor from his great story Leaf by Niggle, Lewis may have worked with broad strokes on a big canvas, getting the whole landscape in a couple of strokes, but Tolkien worked in exquisite detail on just a small part of the painting, getting it just right. So it's not really surprising that Tolkien didn't write any books or articles specifically defending the faith, although we saw that he certainly could do so in his letters. What he did was to work these things into his writing at a deep, fundamental level. As he put it in a letter about The Lord of the Rings, he said, this is quote, that The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults and practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. The religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. I wonder if that gave his colleague C.S. Lewis any ideas. I wonder. But in addition to this thematic element that you can see in his fictional works, Tolkien did, in fact, make a significant contribution to the field of Christian apologetics in what might seem at first to be an unlikely place. This is in his essay on fairy stories. And this, in a way, connects back to how he influenced C.S. Lewis, because when he was having this discussion with C.S. Lewis on Addison's Walk, he found that Lewis had gained kind of the intellectual understanding of the teachings of Christianity, but couldn't go anywhere with it. Because Lewis had this appreciation of the story of the gospel, the story of the dying and rising God, but he couldn't kind of make the connection with the concepts of things like incarnation and resurrection. But what Tolkien helped him to see is that there was no contradiction, no separation between imagination and reason, that Christianity is both story and history, what Lewis would later call myth made fact. And that was a huge push for Lewis to become a Christian and later to develop that idea in many of his apologetics works, which we can then say that Tolkien can take indirect credit for. But the one place that Tolkien does explicate this more directly is in his great essay on fairy stories. And here he talks about how fantasy works, what it is, why we enjoy it so much. And at the end of it, in a characteristically humble, sort of self-deprecating way, at the very end of it, in the epilogue, he expresses a key idea, that the delight that we feel in a fairy tale, the joy that we feel at the happy ending, is in fact a marker of the truth of the Christian story.
This joy, which I have selected as the mark of the true fairy story or romance, or as a seal upon it, merits more consideration. Probably every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the peculiar quality of this secondary world, if not all the details, are derived from reality, or are flowing into it. If he indeed achieves a quality that can fairly be described by the dictionary definition, inner consistency of reality, it is difficult to conceive how this can be if the work does not in some way partake of reality. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction and an answer to that question. Is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world, well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist's part of the artist. But in the eucatastrophe, we see a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. The use of this word gives a hint of my epilogue. It is a serious and dangerous matter. It is presumptuous of me to touch upon such a theme, but if by grace what I say has any respect, any validity, it is, of course, only one facet of truth, incalculably rich, finite only because the capacity of man for whom this was done is finite. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt-making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect, as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of sub-creation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. It is not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history. The joy would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as the joy which the turn and a fairy story gives. Such joy has the very taste of primary truth. Otherwise, its name would not be joy. It looks forward or backward. The direction in this regard is unimportant, to the great eucatastrophe. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is the same kind, but it is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy still go on and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated that he may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the effoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet at the last, redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them as men. Finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know.
So here, I think we have one of Tolkien's finest pieces of writing of all of his prose, and it is, in fact, a work of apologetics, of presenting of his faith through the medium of story. Now, all of this has been very serious, very substantial, and that's all very good. But I must match wit for wit, because I cannot let that pass. So Lewis was a wit, to be sure, but Tolkien could also be witty about his own work. It was, after all, Tolkien who, when he found critics making snarky remarks about The Lord of the Rings, said, "The Lord of the Rings is one of those things. If you like it, you do. If you don't, then you boo." So we have this sense of joy. And for Tolkien, this sense of joy bubbled up in a great sense of fun. And in a way, we've seen already that his life was like a fairy tale with an unexpected happy ending. Now, he certainly knew loss and pain. His father died when he was 4. His mother died when he was 12. And as a young man, he fought in the front lines in World War I, where most of his close friends were killed. So he had a bit of a rough start. And so it's all the more remarkable that Tolkien had such a sense of joy, of fun. He certainly took his work seriously, but he didn't take himself too seriously, as we can see from his own self-description.
I am, in fact, a hobbit in all but size. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated. But to test French cooking, I like and even dare to wear in these dull days ornamental waistcoats. I'm fond of mushrooms out of a field, have a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. I go to bed late and I get up late when possible.
So let me also point out here Tolkien's sense of style. He was a man who knew how to dress well. Nice waistcoats, color, tailored suits, always looking snazzy, in contrast to Lewis's shapeless hat, which once he left on a hedgerow and it got all soggy and just put it back on again. Yes, so we'll just say that Tolkien was the snappier dresser. But really, Tolkien was just a fun sort of guy. There is a story of him coming into one of his lectures on Beowulf, swirling a battle axe and shouting in Anglo-Saxon. I bet that woke the students up. He once dressed up as a polar bear for a children's party and crossed half of Oxford wearing the costume. And He also, for 20 years, devoted a substantial amount of energy to delighting his own children with the Father Christmas letters. Starting in 1920, when his first son, John, was 3 years old, Tolkien secretly created a letter from Father Christmas, which mysteriously appeared. And then he did that every year for the next 20 years, through the childhood of all 4 of his children. And as time went on, the older children became in the game. Now, Tolkien never said, that this was really Father Christmas, just the letters would just appear. Yeah, well, there they are, right, on the mantelpiece or slipped in with the mail. And he made these letters, he wrote them, he illustrated them painstakingly by hand. He even did individual postage stamps from the North Pole to put on the outsides of the letters. The amount of detail is just incredible. And we have to realize that this is a man who's also spending extra time grading papers to make sure that he can pay the bills. And he's still finding time to create these elaborate adventures, these beautifully illustrated adventures, to delight his children year after year. And we can also see, as he does this, his talent as an artist, which I don't think Lewis could even possibly lay any claim to. But Tolkien, in contrast, was a very talented amateur artist, and we can see that he actually illustrates The Hobbit himself. There's his very good illustrations that were included in the published book. And we see this in his Father Christmas letters, where he creates these delightful comic pictures with the story not just of Father Christmas, but of the misadventures of his hapless assistant, the North Polar Bear. And so we'll hear from one of these.
The return address reads, Cliff House, top of the world, near the North Pole, Monday, December 20th, 1926.
My dear boys, I am more shaky than usual this year. The North Polar Bear's fault. It was the biggest bang in the world and the most monstrous firework there has ever been. It turned the North Pole black and shook all the stars out of place, broke the moon into 4, and the man in it fell into my back garden. He ate quite a lot of my Christmas chocolates before he said he felt better, and then he climbed back to mend it and get the stars tidy. Then I found out that the reindeer had broken loose. They were running all over the country, breaking reins and ropes and tossing presents up in the air. They were all packed up to start, you see. Yes, it's only happened this morning. It was a sleigh load of chocolate things, which I always send to Ingrid early. I hope yours are not too badly damaged. But isn't the North Pole Bear silly? And he isn't a bit sorry. Of course he did it. You remember I had to move last year because of him. The tap for turning on the Aurora Borealis fireworks is still in the cellar of my old house. The North Polar Bear knew he must never touch it. I only let it off on special days like Christmas. He says he thought it was cut off since we moved. Anyway, he was nosing around the ruins this morning soon after breakfast. He hides things to eat there and turned on all the northern lights for 2 years in one go.
Father Christmas had to hurry away and leave me to finish. He is old and gets worried when funny things happen. You would have laughed too. I must go and help pack. I don't know what Father Christmas would do without me. He always forgets what a lot of packing I do for him. The snowman is addressing our envelopes this year. He is about Father Christmas's gardener, but we don't get much but snowdrops and frost ferns to grow here. He always writes in white, just with his finger. A Merry Christmas to you from the North Polar Bear.
And love from Father Christmas to all.
So this jolly fellow who could write these Father Christmas letters was also the serious scholar who taught first at Leeds, then in Northern England, then back to Oxford, first at Pembroke College, and then at Merton College, which is what we see here. And I might add that he was a professor at 3 different university positions rather than Lewis's mere 2. Now, Lewis was a brilliant scholar, but so too Tolkien was a brilliant scholar. In fact, he wrote the dictionary. Well, okay, part of it. His first job after he got out of the army at the end of World War I was as an assistant editor for the Oxford English Dictionary, where he did write a number of entries for W. So, in case you're curious, Tolkien wrote the definitions for words like walrus and waistcoat. So if you think about walrus, waistcoat, walruses wearing waistcoats, think of Tolkien. But even though he wrote the dictionary, or at any rate, part of it, he doesn't get appreciated as a scholar quite as much as Lewis does. Now, I will concede that there is a certain reason for that. His scholarly writings tend to be, well, extremely nerdy. Now, I am extremely nerdy myself, so I don't mean that as a slight. But admittedly, Tolkien would go and write things with gripping titles like Some Contributions to Middle English Lexicography, or the page-turning Philology General Works in the Year's Work in English Studies, Volume 4, 1923. But I don't really know that this is really that much nerdier than C.S. Lewis's epic English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. So maybe we can call this a tie. So Tolkien studied languages. That was his thing. But he didn't just learn different languages, although he knew a lot of them. Rather, he studied how languages work, how they change over time, how they develop, why they take the shape that they do, and how the sounds change over time. He was so into this topic, he knew it so well, that Lewis once commented, Tolkien has been inside language. He really immersed himself in it. And whereas Lewis wrote a very excellent book called Studies in Words, Tolkien invented whole new languages and wrote things in those languages. So, wow, I think that's nerdier. We'll just leave it at that. But as a philologist, you could say that he was a literary detective. He was sort of figuring out what words must have existed based on fragments and hints in the existing Old English literature. He was kind of like Strider in The Lord of the Rings, but he was on the track of words. I think that's pretty cool. Now, in a way, something that's even cooler is the fact that Tolkien was kind of a rogue philologist. Now, that's a phrase you don't hear every day. He was daring. You see, he went against the grain of academic philology of his time. In his era, the study of language was all about kind of dissecting it, looking at literary texts only as kind of collections of words to be taken out and put in glossaries and, sorted by frequency and things like that. It's all very well and good, and Tolkien was good at that sort of thing, but he also loved the stories the authors told with these ancient words. So when he came to a text like the Old English poem Beowulf, there he is with the Oxford English Dictionary. When he came to a text like the poem Beowulf, he read it as a story in a way that most of his fellow academics at the time were treating it just as a source of linguistic evidence. Now, I imagine probably a good many of you read Beowulf in college. Whether it was a painful experience or a positive one, you might have read it. Now, there's even been some movie versions of it. Now, they've all been really ridiculously inaccurate, but they're there, right? And I'm going to guess that most of you have at least heard the name Beowulf. Well, that's all due to Tolkien. Before him, Beowulf was just a dusty old manuscript that the philologists looked at as a source of linguistic and historical data. In fact, they thought it was a bit stupid. What's up with all the monsters in it? Monsters? Why? But Tolkien read the poem as a poem, and he saw that it was a really great story. It has an epic hand-to-hand battle between the hero and a cannibalistic monster. And this battle starts in Harrowgate Hall. Beowulf rips off Grendel's arm, and then tracks Grendel to his underwater lair. This is not a James Bond film. Beowulf tracks Grendel to the underwater lair, and there fights the monster's mother, who's really ticked off, with an ancient sword that's forged by trolls. And that's before we even get to the dragon. So it's a really good story, and Tolkien revitalizes it. All the critics were just ignoring it, but he saw that it was a really great story. And so he literally, single-handedly changed Beowulf scholarship by a lecture called Beowulf, the Monsters, and the Critics. And we'll hear a little extract from it.
In Beowulf, we have a historical poem about the pagan past, or an attempt at one. Literal historical fidelity founded on modern research was, of course, not attempted. It is a poem by a learned man writing of old times, who looking back on the heroism and sorrow feels in them something permanent and something symbolical. Beowulf is not a primitive poem. It is a late one, using the materials, then still plentiful, preserved from a day already changing and passing, a time that has now forever vanished, swallowed in oblivion, using them for a new purpose, with a wider sweep of imagination, if with a less bitter and concentrated force. When new Beowulf was already antiquarian, in a good sense, and it now produces a singular effect. For it is now, to use itself, ancient, and yet its maker was telling of things already old and weighted with regret, and he expended his art in making keen that touch upon the heart which sorrows have that are both poignant and remote. There is not much poetry in the world like this, and though Beowulf may not be among the very greatest of poems of our Western world and its tradition, it has its own individual character and peculiar solemnity. It would still have power had it been written in some time or place unknown and without posterity, if it contained no name that could now be recognized or identified by research. Yet, it is in fact written in a language that after many centuries has still essential kinship with our own. It was made in this land and moves in our northern world beneath our northern sky. And for those who are native to that tongue and land, it must ever call with profound appeal until the dragon comes.
So here we have an example of Tolkien being known for his medieval scholarship and putting Beowulf on the map. But it would be a serious mistake to think of him as just a medievalist, to think of him as stuck in the past. Far from it. The whole reason that he could take a poem like Beowulf and make it exciting and relevant to the modern world is that he had a foot in both worlds. He also read very widely in modern literature. And I particularly know this because I've spent the past 7 years almost rivaling the writing of the Lord of the Rings in researching this topic and discovering that Tolkien's first biographer was simply incorrect in saying that Tolkien read little in modern literature. That's just not so. He read very widely indeed, and he had very varied and interesting opinions about what he read. He, in fact, had tastes that at least equaled, if not rivaled, C.S. Lewis's, because he, for instance, knew James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. He read Gertrude Stein and T.S. Eliot. He also liked Agatha Christie's mystery novels. He named Isaac Asimov as a favorite author. In short, he read widely and deeply in modern literature, and this allowed him to be a bridge between the past and the present. And by the way, if you'd like to know more about that, I have a book on the subject coming out next year called Tolkien's Modern Reading. You should read it. So we see Tolkien bridging the past and the present, and this takes us to Tolkien the poet. And here I speak of him as a poet in the broadest sense. He did write poems, yes. He even had some of them set to music. But his gift of poetry extended to all of his imaginative writing in the way that he could evoke beauty and sorrow and action and peace and beautiful landscapes and the internal struggles of character in such a way that we feel that we're there, that we're part of it, that we're moved by it. And Tolkien's masterwork is The Lord of the Rings, a book that's so beautiful and so rich that we can read it again and again and get more out of it every time. And in the first passage that I've chosen from The Lord of the Rings to showcase Tolkien as a poet, we find Frodo and Sam high up in the mountains as they approach the secret pass that will let them into Mordor. Gollum has brought them there, avoiding notice from Sauron's minions. Now Gollum will soon betray them, leading them into the lair of the great spider Shelob. But Frodo and Sam don't know that. Still, both Frodo and Sam know that they are soon to enter into the final stage of their journey, and one that they never expected.
In a dark crevice between two great piers of rock they sat, Frodo and Sam a little way within, and Gollum crouched upon the ground near the opening. There the hobbits took what they expected would be their last meal before they went down into the nameless land, maybe the last meal they would ever eat together. Some of the food of Gondor they ate, and wafers of the waybread of the elves, and they drank a little. But of their water they were sparing, and took only enough to moisten their dry mouths.
We shouldn't be here at all,
said Sam.
if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things the wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them usually. Their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances like us of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you. At least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. You know, coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same, like old Mr. Bilbo. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best tales to get landed in. I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. Beren now, he never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from the Iron Crown in Thangorodrim, and yet he did, and that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Arendelle. And why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales ever end?
No, they never end as tales.
said Frodo.
But the people in them come and go when their parts ended. Our part will end later or sooner.
And then we can have some rest and some sleep.
Said Sam as he laughed grimly.
And I mean just that, Mr. Frodo. I mean plain ordinary rest and sleep and waking up to a morning's work in the garden. I'm afraid that's all I'm hoping for all the time. All the big important plans are not for my sort. Still, I wonder if we shall ever be put into songs or tales. We're in one, of course, but I mean put into words, you know, told by the fireside or read out of a great book with red and black letters, years and years afterwards.
Now, the next passage we'll hear is after Sam and Frodo have fulfilled the quest. They've made their painful way to Mount Doom. Frodo has failed at the last moment, broken by the burden of the ring. But the quest is saved because of pity, the pity that both Bilbo and Frodo took on Gollum, refusing to kill him when they had the chance. So because of this pity, this grace, Gollum is still free, and he seizes the ring, bites off Frodo's finger, falls into the crack of doom. The ring is destroyed, Middle-earth is saved, but it would seem to be saved at the cost of Frodo and Sam's lives. Except that in the eucatastrophe, the happy ending, they are rescued by beyond all hope or expectation, and they are brought to safety and healing. And we have then the passage where we have them honored for their actions.
As they came into the opening in the woods, they were surprised to see knights in bright mail and tall guards in silver and black standing there who greeted them with honor and bowed before them. And then one blew a long trumpet, and they went on through the aisles of trees beside the singing stream. So they came to a wide green land, and beyond it was a broad river in a silver haze, out of which rose a long wooded isle, and many ships lay by its shores. But on the field where they now stood, a great host was drawn up, in ranks and companies glittering in the sun. And as the hobbits approached, swords were unsheathed, and spears were shaken, and horns and trumpets sang, and men cried with many voices and in many tongues, "Long live the halflings! Praise them with great praise!" And so, the red blood blushing in their faces and their eyes shining with wonder, Frodo and Sam went forward and saw that amidst the clamorous host were set 3 high seats built of green turves. Behind the seat on the right floated, white on green, a great horse running free. Upon the left was a banner, silver upon blue, a ship swan-proud faring on the sea. But behind the highest throne in the midst of all, a great standard was spread in the breeze. And there, a white tree flowered upon a sable field beneath a shining crown and 7 glittering stars. On the throne sat a mail-clad man. A great sword was laid across his knees, but he wore no helm. As they drew near, he rose, and then they knew him, changed as he was, so high and glad of face, kingly, lord of men, dark-haired with eyes of gray. Frodo ran to meet him, and Sam followed close behind.
Well, if this isn't the crown of all,
He said,
Strider, or I'm still asleep.
Yes, Sam, Strider.
said Aragorn.
It is a long way, is it not, from Bree, where you did not like the look of me? A long way for us all, but yours has been the darkest road.
And then, to Sam's surprise and utter confusion, he bowed his knee before them. And taking them by the hand, Frodo upon his right and Sam upon his left, he led them to the throne. And setting them upon it, he turned to the men and captains who stood by and spoke, so that his voice rang over all the host, crying,
Praise them with great praise.
And when the glad shout had swelled up and died away again, to Sam's final and complete satisfaction and pure joy, a minstrel of Gondor stood forth and knelt and begged leave to sing. And behold, he said,
Lo, lords and knights and men of valor unashamed, kings and princes, and fair people of Gondor, and riders of Rohan, and ye sons of Elrond and Dudain of the north, and elf and dwarf, and great hearts of the Shire, and all free folk of the rest, Now listen to my lay, for I will sing to you a Frodo of the 9 fingers and the ring of doom.
And when Sam heard that, he laughed aloud for sheer delight, and he stood up and cried.
Oh, great glory and splendor, and all my wishes have come true.
And then he wept. And all the host laughed and wept, and in the midst of their merriment and tears, the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold, and all men were hushed. And he sang to them, now in the elven tongue, now in the speech of the West, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed, and their joy was like swords. And they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness.
My friends, it is true that C.S. Lewis is popular in America. But Tolkien is popular not just in America, not just in England, but globally. His books have been published in languages such as Albanian, Arabic, Chinese, Czech, Greek, Hebrew, Japanese, Korean, Persian, Russian, Thai, and Turkish, to name just a few. He is a true global success because he masters this art of the story, and he can convey sorrow and joy and beauty so powerfully. My friends, I give you J.R.R. Tolkien, literary master.
Thank you, Harvard. Well, first, let me say I am proud to note that we have continued the long academic tradition of going way over time. The streak continues unabated. Second, let me ask everyone to once more thank our actors and our scholars this evening. It's been a real treat. With that said, let me ask our friends in the back to bring the house lights up. We'll do things a little bit out of order. I'm conscious of the fact that in our materials for this evening, we did say that we would aim for 6:30 to 8:30. It's now 8:35, and if there are people who need to get out, I don't want you to miss the excitement of a raffle, because this is America, after all. So, here's what we will do. For those who aren't familiar, and by the way, I should give credit where credit is due. The inspiration for tonight came in large measure from a podcast called Intelligence Squared, which is quite good and recommended, and they occasionally do events like this one. So if you like this sort of thing, you can find other similar events out there online. When you came in, and my sources tell me that we had a total of 314 people in attendance tonight, and of those, 279 put tickets in a box, voting on their way in, whether they were a Lewis person or Team Tolkien. Thank you very much, Danielle and Mariana. Oh, and by the way, you two stop for just a second. Can I ask anyone who works for the Mandel Center or who is a Mandel scholar volunteering tonight to please stand and be recognized? Thank you. This event required a lot of help, and I want to give a special acknowledgement to Mariana Nestorenko, who is a wonderful, wonderful part of our team. Everyone is, but Mariana did a lot of the work that made tonight happen, so thank you, Mariana. So 314 people, 279 tickets. Follow me closely. On the way in, it was close. On the way in, 146 people voted for Clive Staples Lewis, and 132, excuse me, I looked at the wrong number, 133 for Tolkien.
133.
Okay. 133. So we start the evening with Lewis at plus 13. Okay?
Unlucky number.
Now, if you have a phone, please take it out. And if we could go to the Google Chrome window that I believe is open. On your web browser, please go to www.kahoot.it. If you're not familiar with this, this is going to enable us to vote. We're a humanities center, but as you can see, we believe in doing things with scientific precision. So this is going to tell us conclusively once and for all, which author is the greater? So we're waiting for players here, so you'll be able to go to kahoot.it and put in that number 436-381. Is that working for folks? Yeah. Do we need to refresh this page? This should show more than 0 players.
Then we're going to do Keno after this, right?
Do we have any idea what's...
Got a little laugh at the Keno reference.
Yeah, go ahead and reload that.
Are you pleased with yourself?
Okay, so we need the classic version, please, on the left.
Ooh, 73.
And here we go. This will work now. Okay, now put this code in. Sorry about that.
That's very cool.
801597. And it'll ask you for a nickname. You'll put in your initials or something, but it won't. Oh, very good. Okay, here we go.
Oh, wow.
Terrifying.
Wow.
All right, we got a lot of people joining. Very good, very good. Keep them coming.
Was a name Lewis will win.
Wow.
Oh, we
Who's
got.
Sweet Pea?
That's about the Tolkien.
Okay, looks like. Oh, no, we're still going.
An argument for a smartphone or against.
Frojo.
Boy.
Frojo. Who's Frojo?
Oh. Gilbert Keith Chesterton has joined us. Truly an honor.
Can I play?
Absolutely. Oh, no, I don't think you can, actually.
Goat.
We're getting all your information,
All right.
social security numbers.
Okay. All right. Boy, they keep coming. Okay. If we can press the start button on there, please, with 180 players.
81?
And this will load, and you'll see on your phone. That's the question. The winner of the Battle of Literary Masters is, so if you vote for C.S. Lewis, press the red with the triangle. If you vote for Tolkien, blue.
Wow.
They're coming in. People did not take a long time to decide. It sounds like they had already made up their minds. Look at that. Wow. Okay, and I said it's at 30 seconds, so we have to wait 11 more because I overestimated.
Oh, I thought it was like
Oh, it doesn't
180.
show
Oh,
the
I
answers for
see.
Lewis.
That's not.
This is
not-
exciting.
I thought that was good.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah, okay, that was confusing.
I was like, what?
How about that now? However, because Lewis started with a plus 13 lead, that means that the winner tonight is Holly Ordway and J.R.R. Tolkien. But congratulations to everyone. Seriously, that's fantastic.